Welcome everyone to SSA Talks. The purpose of this particular series is actually to discuss, engage with, and perhaps in a sense introduce some of the critical and radical scholarship relating to Sri Lankan studies. And to introduce these works especially to a new generation of researchers based in Sri Lanka as well as overseas. Today we have as our first guest, Dr. Kumari Jayawardena, and our aim is to revisit her popular work, namely Nobodies to Somebodies, The Rise of the Colonial Bourgeoisie in Sri Lanka, which came out in 2000, and a single translation of which came out in 2006, which was very prettily titled Sokkan Lokkan Mu Wagai. Dr. Kumari, welcome to SSA Talks. It's wonderful to have you here. I suppose we can begin with a very basic question, which is, what is the book about, and what kind of research gap were you thinking of filling when you published this?
Well, to take up the second point about the research gap, I had done a book on the rise of the labor movement in Sri Lanka, and I had a feeling that there should be a complement to that book, which has the rise of the capitalist class or the bourgeoisie, or certainly in class terms, because we are dealing in class terms with working class, we should talk about the other classes too. So when I had a sabbatical a long time ago, I spent the time in the archives in Sri Lanka looking for material on this particular issue. The available books were all about caste, rise of the Karava elite, and that is Michael Roberts, Patrick Peebles, the Mudliar elite and 19th century history. Similar title, but the word class didn't come in. It was mainly a question of caste. So I began to think about what did it mean in colonial society, the whole issue of caste. And just to briefly introduce you to that topic, caste was originally occupation-based, and the economy was heavily divided into occupations. With colonial rule, much of that broke down, that people now through education didn't do their traditional occupation, but were able to move into other types of employment in the urban and other sectors. Now, Dr. Uyanguda has called it a colonial caste system, new wine in old bottles, where an archaic system has been accentuated by the incursion of new forms of economic, political, and cultural forces. Now, briefly, obviously, any changes in the economy are going to disrupt a system based on occupation. Politically, now suddenly all castes are deemed having equality, equal access to the law, to the courts, to the juries, to the schools, and that was certainly a major change. And culturally, in terms of social distance too, the old feudal idea of keeping some castes, giving them lower chairs, and this kind of discriminatory behavior gradually diminished, because now something else was happening. So, I quote here Newton Gunasinghe, because he wrote very incisively on caste. There is a disintegration of caste system as a mode of division of labor without leading to the disappearance of caste. So this is the main thing. These things change, but they don't disappear. Both class and caste reproduced in a distorted manner, and class through interpretations of caste and class, in a sense, change. Now, if you have class coming in, then in every caste you will find the class division of who is bourgeois, lower middle class, working class. And in every class too, you would find, while they are joined together with those of other ethnicities who we can define later, who belong to the same class, but the caste never disappeared, it was there. So briefly, and very briefly, that is why I came to look at this dichotomy between class and caste and the rise of the new class.
And in a sense, to emphasize the rise of the bourgeoisie, the class, that was perhaps the main purpose.
Yeah.
The book involves a discussion of a number of persons, personalities, families, and you've based your research also on sources that were taken from these families or given to you from them, by them. What was it like researching on this issue, Dr. Kumari? Was it, were the people interested in it, or was it something risky that you're undertaking?
Well, it was both, because everybody likes to talk about themselves and their families. So you can get them, after a beer or so, getting moving about your illustrious grandfather and your illustrious father and how great they were. And then you get all the gossip of the family. Later, don't forget this and that, and who ran away with whom, and what happened. And so you learn a huge number of what look like irrelevant factors, but actually sometimes they're quite relevant when you start thinking back. So, yeah, there was that risk that they might get annoyed with me, thinking I've distorted things about their family, and two families did object, because this story is mainly how capital accumulation took place through liquor renting. And descendants of those families objected. You see, many of them were Christian, but they had this Buddhist value system whereby one of the prohibited professions is selling liquor. So they were in two minds about it. But it was also the most lucrative. It was like the stock exchange of its time. The returns were fabulous. So if you joined with somebody and you did a bit of dabbling in the liquor renting, you could make a fortune or two.
Going back to the issue of the separate categories that you discuss, the book's central emphasis is, as you pointed out a little while ago, on class, the bourgeoisie of Ceylon, and the rise and role of capitalism. What was the Ceylonese or the Sri Lankan bourgeoisie like, compared also with the bourgeoisie of perhaps India, for example?
Yeah, that's a very important point, because bourgeoisie, well, first there was a nucleus of a bourgeoisie, which came from the small traders. In every village almost there was a couple of guys who were doing a bit of trading, taking goods and services from the south to the Candian areas, and amazingly, these people who later became very important, very wealthy, they started by literally carting firewood, spices, rice, liquor in small quantities, both to the people who are opening up plantations and later on, of course, to the plantation workers who were the big market for liquor, and also for soldiers who were stationed right up to Nuwara. The small trader was taking things right up that line. So obviously the profits were not so great, but there were some profits. And I'd like to just tell you the narrative of Jeronis Soiza, who was known as Babasinya Vedamahatya. They all had these colorful names. He was a small trader in Kandy, but he was from Moratuwa. And he and his brothers had been doing this trade, and they opened a trading depot in Kandy. Then with that money, he bought access to the Kadugannawa tavern, one tavern, paid something and got the rights. With the profits from that, he started buying various bits of coffee land. And they never looked back after that, because once he got access to one tavern, he bid for the larger, for all the Kandy taverns, and ultimately got all the central province right to sell liquor in the central province, which by 1848 was so big that to bid for that you needed 24,000 pounds were the bidding rates. So you can imagine the amount of money that was coming in through this means. And they diversified first into coffee, then into mining in Bogala, Dodangaslanda and various places, into buying coconut estates, and later rubber, into educating the next generation. That was important for them, and many of those young men went abroad for education. Now, this is where the contradiction starts, and I will go into that later.
In your book, you also refer to these two categories, one being the old rich somebodies and the other being the new rich nobodies. So it was not just a question of nobodies becoming somebodies, but there was this exclusive club of somebodies who resisted the idea of sharing space. How did that tension sort of work out in society?
Well, first, it's very interesting that the comic opera writers in England, Gilbert and Sullivan, wrote the Gondoliers, in which there was a line that, I think you can quote it from that. I should get it right because it's an important line. When everyone is somebody, then nobody is anybody. So, Christopher Obesekara of the famous Bandarnayaka family, who was the most reactionary Mahamudliya character around, he took this up and said about D.S.N. Nayaka, D.B. Jayatilaka and all that crowd, and no doubt about many others, who are these nobodies? Where did they come from? They were they were all Goigama, but Obesekaras were the first class Goigama, and all these Senanayakas they thought of as second or I don't know, whatever class Goigama. So he was very annoyed. And in the Legislative Council he said this, who are these nobodies? And that's where the title of the book came from, that particular usage of a comic opera in England by Christopher Obesekara, Chandrika Bandarnayaka's great-grandfather. So the tension of caste then started coming into the scene.
Before your book was published, the great emphasis was on caste. But this was also a time the